Opening the center and developing attacking prospects, this pawn push immediately stakes a claim for central squares. Provoking an immediate strategic struggle for central squares, Sicilian defense ignites asymmetrical pawn structures and rich counterattacking chances. Developing the knight so naturally prepares for central pawn advances and potential kingside castling. Opening the kingside diagonal for the bishop, this prepares a solid pawn chain and eventual development, accepting a slightly more passive structure for central control. Securing the center and preparing for rapid development, this move aims for a solid, harmonious pawn structure. Securing the queenside's advance with a modest pawn push, this subtle preparation aims to discourage white's central ambitions and potentially open a new pathway for the rook. Developing the bishop to a more passive square, this prepares for kingside castling, but sacrifices some attacking potential on the d4 square. Developing the knight to its natural outpost secures central influence and prepares for pawn advances, a sensible consolidation. Initiating central engagement, d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for piece activity and create potential weaknesses. This capture clarifies the center, opening lines for development while relinquishing central pawn presence for dynamic counterplay. Sacrificing a tempo for a central pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop, this knight redistribution reclaims central influence, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially launch a kingside attack. Reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to challenge white's central grip becomes priority one for black. Developing the bishop to e3 offers robust support for the central pawns and prepares to castle kingside, reinforcing the kingside's defensive structure. Developing the knight to f6 is a natural continuation, solidifying central influence and preparing for castling, while also eyeing potential tactical skirmishes around white's king if the position opens unfavorably. Aggressively seizing the initiative, white aims to expand their queenside space and cramp black's development, potentially preparing for a central pawn storm or a kingside assault by first solidifying the pawn chain. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies the queenside pawn structure, preparing for castling and potentially eyeing the central d4 pawn with future queen or bishop maneuvers. Shifting the bishop to the third rank offers a commanding view along the h5-e8 diagonal, potentially influencing future attacks on the kingside and supporting a central pawn push. Instigating action along the c-file, black prepares to contest control and potentially launch an assault on white's king, which remains somewhat exposed in the center. Unlocking the kingside with this castling action secures the monarch and prepares to activate the rooks along the open files that are beginning to emerge. Solidifying the bishop's retreat and preparing for future knight maneuvers on the queenside demonstrates a commitment to developing black's pieces to more secure and active squares. Securing the queenside flank becomes paramount as white seeks to expand its dominion beyond the central tension. Finally bringing the monarch to safety, black completes kingside castling, solidifying the pawn shield and connecting the rooks, which now stand poised to contest the open central files or support potential pawn breaks in the queenside territory. A subtle repositioning of the knight, aiming to redeploy it towards the queenside where black's pawn structure presents fewer immediate threats. This maneuver also clears the d4 square for a potential future pawn advance or piece support, offering white greater flexibility in orchestrating its forces. Black decisively breaks open the center, challenging white's centralized knight and aiming to liberate their queenside pieces while potentially creating attacking avenues on the kingside. A bold gambit to stifle black's queenside expansion, this thrust aims to claim territory and lock down the queenside, preventing any immediate counterplay from black's minor pieces. However, it sacrifices a pawn's advance possibility and creates a slight weakness on b5, potentially inviting a future black rook maneuver. Black liberates the e-file for potential piece activity, a proactive measure in a position characterized by constricted development, and immediately challenges white's advanced pawn structure, potentially creating imbalances that can be exploited later. The bishop embarks on a crucial reconnaissance mission, eyeing the potentially exposed kingside and preparing to support an eventual central pawn push. Navigating the knights becomes a key consideration as black repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. Prioritizing pawn structure over piece activity here seems a bit hesitant, potentially allowing black's knights greater influence and reducing white's pawn majority's long-term effectiveness. Reclaiming initiative and preparing to contest the e-file, black recenters the rook, a tactical geometric maneuver to challenge white's advanced pawn structure and potentially generate counterplay. Suddenly, the queenside pawn structure is about to get a serious workout, with the white queen aiming to pry open lines for her artillery, potentially creating tactical fireworks around black's otherwise cozy king. A bold maneuver, this bishop repositions to contest the critical e6-c4 diagonal, potentially eyeing the white king's safety and preparing for future kingside action. Shifting the king from the center of the action, kh1 cleverly repositions away from any potential diagonal threats and prepares for a potential rook lift along the third rank, offering more flexibility for the king's safety and future piece coordination. Black's knight boldly ventures to c4, challenging white's centralized pieces and creating a dynamic tension. This knight now eyes the d2 square and exerts pressure on the queen side, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure if white isn't careful. It's a statement of intent, a proactive maneuver that forces white to immediately consider defensive and counterattacking possibilities. Securing the rook's safety from that pesky bishop threat on the diagonal becomes paramount. But this maneuver also subtly prepares a potential kingside expansion, aiming to clamp down on black's central space and eventually exploit the semi-open queenside files. Black aims to connect the rooks and potentially eye the c3 knight, seeking to untangle their pieces and create dynamic play after white's aggressive setup. This bold knight sortie into d5 immediately challenges black's central control and aims to exploit potential weaknesses around the f7 square, creating a double-edged situation where black must be extremely precise to maintain equilibrium. Striking at the center with the knight offers a clear path to simplifying the position, albeit at the cost of its active outpost, potentially opening the d-file for your rook and freeing up the queenside from immediate pressure. Opening up the e-file injects immediate dynamism into the center, forcing black to confront the pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses in their own structure. White's intention is to exploit the newly available diagonal for the queen and bishop, seeking to disrupt black's harmonious development, especially after the exchange on d5. This maneuver aims to seize the initiative and create imbalances that can be leveraged for an advantage, rather than settling for a passive position. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the queenside is a wise regrouping, aiming to challenge white's central pawn and potentially open lines for counterplay, while also preparing to defend against any incursions along the file. Capturing the pawn opens a diagonal for the white queen, directly threatening the black bishop on e6 and putting pressure on the kingside. This aggressive queen sortie aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. The queen repositioning creates an interesting tension, seeking to either exploit the open diagonal or potentially reinforce the kingside defense if needed, while also inviting a pawn exchange that might simplify the position favorably for black if white isn't careful. Shedding the bishop for a knight on the queenside fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating potential isolated pawn weaknesses for black on the queenside if those pawns are advanced later, while simultaneously opening lines for white's rook on the file. The rook now actively eyes the c-file, seeking to exploit any weakness and potentially tie down the white queen. Consolidating pawn structure along the third rank seems like a sensible step, aiming to create a more robust defensive shield for the king and prevent any immediate infiltration by black's remaining pieces. The bishop now ventures to the queenside, eyeing the pawn structure and seeking active participation, a sharp contrast to its passive placement earlier. Shifting the rook to the first rank, white aims to consolidate its material advantage and potentially prepare for a rook lift to the kingside, a common maneuver to increase attacking potential when the center is somewhat closed. The immediate goal is to reposition the rook, perhaps eyeing the g-file or even preparing to bring it to the defense of the king if black can generate threats. This is a quiet repositioning move, signaling a desire to improve piece coordination and avoid any tactical oversights from black's active bishop on b5. It's about building a more harmonious defensive and offensive structure. The rook swings across the board, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's weakness on the queen side, potentially creating threats down the now semi-open, a file and disrupting white's harmonious piece placement. Reshaping the knight's outpost, this repositioning aims to exploit the now open d5 diagonal and prepare a potential advance into the queenside territory, creating a new dynamic for white's minor pieces. Unleashing the rook to the second rank creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of white's bishop and potentially trap it. This bold advance, while seemingly aggressive, also invites white to solidify their central control further, a delicate balance of tactical opportunity and positional risk. Tightening the grip on the queen side, this pawn push aims to dislodge the intrusive bishop from its commanding diagonal and begin the process of regaining material balance by exploiting the awkward placement of black's rook. Safeguarding the bishop from immediate tactical threats is paramount, rerouting it to a more passive square. The rook's activation along the open file is a crucial step, aiming to disrupt black's comfortable piece arrangement and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the black king. A patient repositioning of the bishop, shifting it from the active but potentially vulnerable outpost on d7 to the more secure diagonal that now opens up towards the king side, hinting at future defensive consolidation or even an offensive sortie down the h2-b8 diagonal if white falters. The rook swap initiates a structural shift, aiming to alleviate white's cramped position and enter an endgame where the passed pawn might eventually become a factor, although black's bishop pair still offers significant compensation. A surprising maneuver, rerouting the rook from its defensive post to secure an open file, potentially creating a new avenue of attack or bolstering the pawn's structure against further encroachment, while also freeing up its counterpart. Reclaiming the knight, white aims to reposition this piece to a more active square, likely intending to pressure black's pawns or support a future kingside advance, while simultaneously clearing the d-file for potential rook activity. Unleashing the rook to the second rank, black initiates a daring raid, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially fork the king and rook. This aggressive maneuver injects immediate tactical complexity into what was becoming a more positional struggle, forcing white to react decisively or risk significant material loss. The rook's newfound activity on the open file presents a potent threat, demanding careful calculation from white to defend against the imminent dangers. Capturing the pawn on d6 immediately throws a wrench into black's carefully constructed defensive setup, sacrificing material to disrupt their pieces and potentially opening lines toward their king. Seizing the initiative by snatching the pawn, you're aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the newly opened diagonal for your bishop. This bold pawn grab introduces immediate tactical complications, forcing white to address the threat to their queenside pawns, while you simultaneously try to solidify your material advantage. The question is whether this aggressive thrust will overextend your forces or prove to be the decisive turning point in this complex middle-game struggle. Unleashing a knight to e5 redirects white's attention toward the queenside, aiming to exploit the exposed black bishop on a5 and potentially create new attacking avenues by disrupting black's pawn structure. Reactivating the bishop to d8 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to free the rook on the c-file and potentially prepare for a central pawn push later. Unlocking a long-blocked diagonal with this pawn thrust immediately complicates matters, forcing black's bishop off its aggressive outpost and potentially isolating that advanced pawn. Black's bishop now strategically occupies the long diagonal, creating potential threats towards white's kingside and challenging the pawn structure. Unlocking the file is the primary objective, aiming to generate pressure against black's queenside pawns. Provoking white's king into potential tactical skirmishes with the newly opened central file, black dares to exploit the lingering structural weaknesses and activate their remaining pieces. Reclaiming the outpost on f3 allows white to eye the vulnerable b2 pawn, a potential future target as the game simplifies. Harnessing the bishop's newfound diagonal power, black decisively challenges white's centralized battery, aiming to disrupt any immediate pawn advances and unlock new attacking possibilities across the board. Asserting control over the b-file, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's advanced bishop and potentially liberate the rook for active participation on a more open file or even the kingside. Unlocking the kingside pressure. This advance on the f-file aims to dismantle white's pawn structure and create attacking potential against their potentially exposed monarch, while simultaneously opening avenues for your own pieces to become more active. Guarding against that sneaky pawn advance on the g-file allows the king a bit more breathing room, while simultaneously preparing for a potential fight over the central pawns. The bishop's relocation to b2 now creates a fascinating tension, directly challenging the white rook and forcing an immediate decision about how to resolve the pressure on the long diagonal. Shifting the rook to the open file aims to activate it and challenge black's control, but it might overlook the immediate threat to your king's safety as black's bishop eyes that critical diagonal. Repositioning the rook to the open file dramatically intensifies the pressure on white's queenside pawns, creating a potent battery with the b2 pawn and threatening to dismantle the defense. Finally, the queens are off the board, ushering in a phase where careful piece placement and pawn structure will determine everything. Sacrificing the bishop to gain a tempo and clear the back rank for your rook's infiltration, black aims to exploit the exposed white king. Unblocking the king's path to safety, the knight's repositioning now prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially creating advanced pawn threats down the queenside. A new bishop emerges from its comfortable rear guard, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain's advanced foothold and reclaim some squares on the queenside. Pawn storming forward, this thrust aims to solidify control of the central files and restrict the enemy bishop's mobility. Opening the b-file now grants the opponent a potent diagonal threat with their bishop, potentially leading to a cascade of exchanges that will leave your king dangerously exposed. Initiating the pawn storm to secure a decisive material advantage, leveraging the open c-file for potential threats. The bishop retreats, seeking refuge from the open files and aiming to support potential pawn advances further down the board, perhaps on the kingside if the opportunity arises. Unlocking the advanced passed pawn's potential, this move boldly seizes the 7th rank, threatening to become an unstoppable queen and fundamentally altering the endgame's power dynamics. Acknowledging the relentless march of white's passed pawn, black scrambles to organize a defense, attempting to shield the king and perhaps find some counterplay against the weakened queenside pawns. This knight sacrifices itself to become a crucial outpost, ready to disrupt black's advancing pawn structure and potentially support a king hunt. Seeking respite for the king, the monarch ventures into the central arena, aiming to escape the looming pawn threat on the queen file and potentially activate itself in the coming endgame skirmish. Unleashing the bishop to pin the black king to the center, this move aims to exploit the now awkward placement of black's knight and the slightly exposed king. Acknowledging the king's precarious position, black hastens to shield it from the looming bishop, aiming to consolidate the defenses before white's rook can become too active along the open file. Securing that knight on d4 is paramount. It's now a linchpin, ready to leap forward and potentially fork the king and rook, creating immediate tactical complications for black. The bishop vacates the diagonal, potentially preparing to redeploy for a more active role on the queenside, or perhaps a tactical dive to capture pawns. The knight returns to a familiar square, aiming to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential advances or defensive maneuvers, a flexible regrouping after the recent exchanges. A new pawn structure emerges, aiming to solidify the king's safety and potentially open a path for the rook. Pawn pushing on the kingside aims to create a protected passed pawn, a classic endgame strategy. Capturing that pawn opens a pathway for your king, transforming a static defensive position into a more active, albeit risky, endgame scenario, where central pawn advances become a priority. The king steps out from its protected shell, seeking broader horizons and potentially an active role in the unfolding endgame battle. The king, abandoning its protected corner, embarks on a perilous journey towards the queenside, a risky maneuver in this crowded position. Initiating a slow, purposeful repositioning of the monarch, aiming to secure it behind the pawn chain while simultaneously preparing to support a future queenside pawn advance. The king emerges from its shell, seeking activity on the open plains after the recent pawn exchanges, a bold sortie into potentially contested territory. The king ventures forward, initiating a precarious dance towards the center, seeking active participation as the pawn structure solidifies on the queenside. Unleashing pawn energy aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces, though it comes with the risk of creating structural weaknesses if not properly supported. Gaining crucial central space with the monarch, this advance aims to activate the king as a powerful attacking piece, aiming to support pawns and potentially create decisive weaknesses in the enemy formation. Finally, black unlocks some dynamic play by capturing the pawn, hoping to activate that passive bishop and perhaps create some counterplay against white's imposing pawn structure. Opening up the h-file now allows your rook to directly threaten the f7 pawn and create more dynamic attacking potential against black's somewhat exposed king. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on a more active diagonal offers a glimmer of hope, challenging the pawn chain's stranglehold and seeking out potential weaknesses. Pushing the king forward, aiming to use its newfound activity to support the advancing pawns and potentially create a mating net against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Unleashing the pawn's potential to create a pass threat, this advance challenges the white king's safety and aims to disrupt the solid pawn structure. Bringing the monarch into the fray signals a clear intention to exploit the advanced pawn and potentially create mating threats, a bold gamble in this pawn-heavy endgame where the king's safety is usually paramount. A last-ditch attempt to dislodge the entrenched king, though the pawn sacrifice feels like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic given white's pawn chain and active monarch. Activating the knight towards a more commanding central influence opens up avenues for a potential breakthrough, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Conceding the advanced passed pawn on the queenside, the defending monarch's safety is now severely compromised as the opposing army orchestrates a powerful, converging attack on the kingside. Snatching the undefended pawn with the knight decisively alters the pawn structure and restricts black's king's escape routes. Discovering a new path for the bishop, this attempt to activate it and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure brings a fresh dynamic, though it might also expose the king further to lurking threats from the knight on a4. Saving the king from that surprising discovered check is paramount, and maneuvering it into the open with this capture, while seemingly risky, actually draws it away from immediate threats and prepares for potential counterplay in the center. The passed pawn, now fortified by its knight escort, marches with relentless purpose towards promotion, aiming to become an unstoppable force. Protecting the advanced pawn with the bishop offers a moment of respite, solidifying a central stronghold while the opposition attempts to break through on the queenside. The kingside structure unravels, inviting aggressive piece play and exposing the monarch to a potential storm from the center. The king's daring foray forward to g6 injects a dramatic element into this endgame, transforming a relatively static position into one brimming with aggressive potential, forcing black to confront immediate threats to their own monarch. Unleashing the king's final march begins, a bold gamble to seize central control and disrupt white's developing pawn structure. The knight's leap injects a sharp forcing sequence, aiming to dislodge the black king from its precarious resting spot near the queenside. Sacrificing the pawn to expose the white king offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt the suffocating positional squeeze and create counterplay. Initiating a pursuit towards black's exposed monarch. Relocating the bishop to the c1 square finally solidifies its defensive presence, providing a vital shield for the king and anticipating potential checks from the white rook on the second rank should it swing back. Unblocking the bishop's path is paramount, allowing it to return to its defensive duties and deter any further infiltration by black's queen. Brings the bishop back into the game, offering a vital defensive shield for the king's side and preventing white's knight from hopping into an immediately dangerous square. The knight embarks on a perilous journey, venturing deep into enemy territory, a daring reconnaissance mission aimed at disrupting black's pawn formation. The bishop's retreat allows the knight to potentially establish a stronger outpost on the 7th rank. The knight repositions to threaten the king, initiating a forcing sequence designed to disrupt black's pawn structure and force concessions. The rook's triumphant advance to B1 heralds a critical juncture, black's king suddenly exposed to the full force of white's remaining pieces, a stark contrast to the prior careful maneuvering. Consolidating the knight on the queen's side offers a fresh defensive setup, preparing to support the advancing kingside pawns by redeploying to G2 for eventual attack or retreat. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the path for the passed pawn's promotion is a desperate, but likely necessary, gamble to maintain any hope of drawing this endgame. The king, now liberated from its pawn shield, marches forward to claim its share of the board, a bold assertion of endgame dominance. The king's flight to the queen's side, though seemingly safe, leaves it isolated from defensive resources and potentially exposed to a swift, pincer-like maneuver by the remaining pieces.